The atmosphere at Los Angeles International Airport was almost electric. A mix of anxiety and anticipation lingered among passengers waiting for Flight 317 to Tokyo. Among the first-class travelers, one man stood out, Oliver Bennett. Not for his charm or admirable behavior, but for carrying an ego so inflated it demanded attention by itself. Oliver was the founder of a trending startup, which he proudly flaunted on social media. He didn't just want to be seen as a revolutionary in technology, but as the man changing the world with his ideas. His exuberant confidence was almost tangible, turning every interaction into an exhibition of arrogance. A flight attendant greeted him with a professional but visibly forced smile, a detail perhaps only Oliver failed to notice. He walked past her with a typical air of superiority, carrying his expensive blazer folded over his arm, and made his way to his seat. For him, first class wasn't just a comfort. It was a status symbol, a living proof of his success. As he settled his belongings and adjusted his state-of-the-art headphones, he let out a satisfied sigh upon noticing the adjacent seat. Seat 2B was still unoccupied. Perfect, he murmured, clearly relieved at the prospect of not having to share his space with someone who might disrupt his privacy. Perhaps it was arrogance, but to Oliver, it was just efficiency. Fewer distractions on the flight meant more time to work on what he liked to call his plans to revolutionize the world of technology. However, any relief he felt was soon interrupted when a modest-looking man appeared. He wore a simple hoodie, jeans, and a baseball cap that partially obscured his face. There was nothing striking about him, no aura of someone who could pique Oliver's interest, and perhaps for that reason alone, Oliver immediately ignored him. The stranger slid quietly into seat 2B. Oliver gave him a brief glance and returned to his laptop, already engrossed in his self-importance. The man politely wished him a good evening as he sat down, but Oliver, though aware, responded with deliberate indifference, murmuring something imperceptible, just enough to cut off any chance of conversation. He was there to work, or at least to make it seem like he was too busy to care about anyone around him. Minutes later, Oliver was enjoying the fleeting comfort of forgetting his neighbor existed. But as the engines roared to life and the flight reached cruising altitude, the man in seat 2B began to bother him in an odd way. Something about him seemed familiar, but Oliver couldn't quite put his finger on why. Perhaps it was his calm confidence, or maybe the slight smile he wore as he looked at his phone. Even so, Oliver decided not to waste time worrying about trivial details. Moments later, the flight attendant entered the scene, offering the first round of drinks. Oliver, as usual, chose champagne, while the man next to him requested water. Water, Oliver murmured to himself, almost in disbelief. Then, as if by reflex, he couldn't resist making a sarcastic comment, loud enough for the man to hear. Seriously? Water? Looks like you should be in economy class. The man only gave a faint smile and didn't react beyond that. To Oliver, this act of ignorance only amplified his need to assert a superiority that for some reason seemed to escape him on this flight. But it got worse when Oliver decided to strike up a conversation. He was ready to become the protagonist of whatever dialogue arose. So, with all his eloquence, he asked his first question. So, what do you do for a living? The man responded simply, I work in technology. The words were spoken with a calmness that nearly neutralized Oliver's attempt to shine. Feeling challenged, Oliver continued, thinking he could dominate the attention. Sounds like we'd have a lot of industry war stories to share, he said. I'm the CEO of a software startup. It's amazing how tech is full of overrated figures like Elon Musk. He started, of course, with a criticism disguised as an opinion. The man in the seat next to him remained neutral. Maybe that was what provoked Oliver. A huge ego simply couldn't stand being ignored. And it was in this calculated silence that he launched into a true tirade. Musk? Come on. SpaceX blowing up rockets? Tesla? Pure exaggeration. And Twitter? The biggest disaster in modern history. Oliver didn't stop. The more he talked, the more he seemed to seek validation for his cynical view of the tech industry. The man, for his part, only listened and occasionally responded with even more enigmatic phrases like, "You seem very passionate," or "He's done some interesting things." These vague answers clearly irritated Oliver, making him intensify his need to prove his point. But the most significant, or perhaps most humiliating, moment was yet to come, and it arrived without warning. In the middle of yet another provocation, the flight attendant addressed the man in seat 2B with a formal and almost reverent tone. "Mr. Musk, the captain asked me to confirm your connection in Tokyo." The impact of her words was like an invisible punch straight to Oliver's ego. He literally froze. The realization hit like an overwhelming weight. His mouth went dry, and words vanished from his mind. The unassuming, casual man with a baseball cap sitting next to him was none other than Elon Musk. Every critique, every insult, every sharp word thrown earlier now hung in the air like ghosts of his own carelessness. Elon simply thanked the flight attendant with a small nod and calmly returned to his book, almost as if nothing had happened. But from that moment on, Oliver's world was no longer the same. Not because of Elon Musk himself, but because he realized that everything he had said, done, and insinuated had been directed at the wrong person at the wrong time. The embarrassment was now not just his own. The atmosphere in first class seemed to silently overflow with this tension. Other passengers noticed the interaction, but no one said anything directly. After all, gestures speak louder than words in situations like this. The revelation that the man in seat 2B was, in fact, Elon Musk, left Oliver completely paralyzed. He tried to organize the avalanche of thoughts hitting him, but it was as if his mind had frozen. After a few minutes of uncomfortable silence, Oliver finally found the courage to say something, though hesitantly. He turned slightly toward Elon and, almost stammering, said, "So, you're Elon Musk?" It was obvious that he wanted to confirm something he already knew to be true, but needed to hear from Elon himself. In the same calm voice that now intimidated him in a way he'd never experienced before, Elon briefly looked up from his book and replied lightly, "That's what they say. Simple, without arrogance, without evident resentment." Yet it was as if Oliver had taken another invisible blow. Oliver sat in silence. What had once been a torrent of words and bravado was now a black hole of embarrassment and regret. He avoided eye contact, hoping no one else in first class had noticed what had transpired. However, it was clear that a few passengers had caught on. Subtle whispers and quick glances toward Elon Musk only added to Oliver's humiliation. Elon, for his part, seemed oblivious to Oliver's discomfort. He remained focused on his book, turning the pages with a calmness that was almost provocative. But it wasn't arrogance, it was composure. And that only made Oliver more uneasy. He needed to say something to fix what he had done, even though he had no idea where to begin. The flight continued in deceptive calm. The soft cabin lights, the low hum of the engine, and the efficient service from the crew did nothing to ease Oliver's discomfort. He stared at his laptop screen, but the graphs and spreadsheets that once provided refuge now felt distant and irrelevant. His mind was stuck on the impact of his words and the revelation of who his seatmate truly was. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of awkward silence, Oliver gathered enough courage to speak. He turned slightly, looking at Elon, who still seemed absorbed in his book. "So, you're really Elon Musk?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant, as if seeking confirmation of something he already knew. Elon raised his eyes briefly, showing no hostility, but also no special interest. He replied with a simple, enigmatic, "That's what they say." There was something in Elon's tone that disarmed any attempt to prolong the conversation. But Oliver, feeling the need to redeem himself, couldn't stop. "Look, about what I said earlier," he began, stammering slightly. "It wasn't personal, you know? Just opinions about the industry." Elon closed his book and rested it on his lap. He looked directly at Oliver with a steady gaze, his expression revealing neither anger nor approval. There was something in Elon's eyes that seemed to cut through any excuse. "Criticism doesn't bother me, Oliver," he said, addressing him by name, a detail that made the startup so feel even smaller. "As long as it's constructive." The weight of that sentence made Oliver lean back slightly. He knew his earlier words hadn't been constructive. They were driven by ego and a desperate need to be the smartest person in the room. Or in this case, the cabin. I admit I was too quick to judge, Oliver said, trying to maintain his composure. I guess sometimes we don't understand the scale of what you're doing. Elon remained silent for a few seconds, as if deciding whether it was worth continuing the conversation. Finally, he leaned forward slightly, a gesture that seemed to indicate he would give Oliver a chance. You mentioned SpaceX's rockets earlier, and you're right about the explosions, Elon began, his tone calm but purposeful. They're public, and each one is a reminder of how much we still have to learn. But do you know what happens after every failure? Progress. Every explosion brings us closer to a bigger goal. Oliver swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words. There was no arrogance in Elon's tone, just the conviction of someone who understood the risks and rewards of pursuing something monumental. And Tesla? Elon continued. You said we're overrated, but did you know our driver assistance system has already saved thousands of lives? Thousands, Oliver. How many mistakes can justify those results? Oliver felt himself sinking into his seat, not from shame this time, but from something deeper, as if his perspectives were being challenged and rearranged. I've never thought about it that way, Oliver murmured, more to himself than to Elon. Most people don't, Elon replied with a faint smile. It's easy to criticize when you don't see the full picture. Innovation requires chaos, risk, and yes, public failures. But those are the ingredients of progress. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Oliver stared out of the airplane window, seeing only the dark night sky. His mind, however, was far away, navigating through thoughts of regret and a growing desire to learn something from the moment. When the flight attendant returned to collect the empty glasses, Oliver asked for a glass of water, declining the champagne. He noticed Elon's quick glance at the change in choice, but said nothing. Mr. Musk, Oliver began again, hesitating. I know I might have sounded foolish earlier, but is there something you would recommend for someone like me? I mean, someone trying to make an impact, but maybe lost on how to do it. Elon regarded him for a moment before answering. His tone was serious, but carried a hint of empathy. Start by listening more, Oliver, and talking less. Real change comes from deeply understanding the problem before offering a solution. Those words echoed in Oliver's mind for the rest of the flight. He knew he wouldn't change overnight, but something had been planted in his consciousness. Something he knew he needed to cultivate if he truly wanted to make an impact. Silence returned between them. But this time, it wasn't charged with tension. It was filled with respect. Time seemed to slow within the cabin, the air thick with tension. The gun in the man's hand trembled slightly, but it was clear that Elon's words had created a crack in his resolve. The man, who had introduced himself as Jonas, stared at Musk with a mix of anger, confusion, and unexpected vulnerability. You don't understand, Jonas shouted, though his voice no longer carried the same force. You live in this world of luxury and opportunity, while we— He paused, breathing heavily. We have to fight for everything, every single day. Elon didn't break eye contact. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his tone remaining calm but firm. You're right, the system is unfair. But violence won't fix that. You might not believe me, but I want to hear you. I want to understand what you need. Elon paused briefly, choosing his next words carefully. Maybe I can't fix everything, but we can start with something. The silence that followed was deafening. Jonas seemed paralyzed, as though the invitation to express his feelings was something he had never received before. Slowly, he lowered his arm, the gun still in his hand, but now pointed at the floor. The atmosphere in the cabin, though still tense, softened slightly. Start by telling me your name, Elon continued. Jonas hesitated, looking around as if seeking approval or protection in the frightened faces of the passengers. It's Jonas, he finally said, his voice low and hesitant. Jonas, Elon repeated, his tone warm and welcoming. You're right to be frustrated. There's so much wrong with the world, and it often feels like no one cares. But tell me, what brought you here today? The question took Jonas by surprise. He opened his mouth to speak but closed it again, as if unsure where to begin. After a few seconds, he started talking, his words halting but gaining intensity as he continued. My family, we lost everything. My wife got sick, and I couldn't afford her treatment. We tried everything. And then, when I finally got a stable job, the company shut down. He gripped the gun tighter, tears forming in his eyes. I was abandoned by the government, by the companies, by everyone. And now I'm here, trying to survive, while you only care about your profits and your useless technologies. Oliver, frozen in his seat, couldn't look away. Jonas's story carried a brutal truth, but also a painful familiarity. It was a reality Oliver knew existed, but had always chosen to ignore. He felt the weight of his own actions, his empty critiques, and disdain for struggles he'd never faced. "You're right to feel angry, Jonas," Elon said, maintaining his calm tone. "And that's why we need people like you. People who point out where we're failing. But the difference between destroying and building lies in how we choose to handle that anger." Jonas stared at Elon, his expression shifting again between anger and confusion. "Building? You only build for the rich, for people who already have everything." Elon shook his head slightly, his expression remaining resolute. "Not always, Jonas. Think about what we can do together. Clean energy, global internet access, making healthcare more affordable. These things aren't perfect, but they're steps in the right direction. And yes, we can do more. But we need people like you to help us see where we're going wrong." Jonas seemed to wrestle with an internal storm, his emotions oscillating rapidly. The gun in his hand now hung limply, and his posture had lost much of its initial aggression. What would you do if you were me?" Jonas asked, almost as a challenge. Elon took a deep breath, his response deliberate and measured. "I would use this anger, this despair, as fuel for something greater. It's not easy. It's frustrating. But changing the world starts with small steps. Think about it. Jonas, what can you do to make your voice heard, to give your family and others in your situation a real chance?" The silence that followed was almost suffocating. Jonas looked down at the gun in his hand, as if seeing it for the first time. His breathing became erratic, and finally, he lowered his head, letting the weapon fall to the floor with a soft thud. One of the flight attendants, who had remained frozen during the entire interaction, approached cautiously and picked up the gun. The passengers exhaled collectively, a nearly palpable relief filling the cabin. Jonas sat in an empty seat nearby, covering his face with his hands. It was as if all the energy that had propelled him to this moment had dissipated. Elon watched him for a moment before standing and walking toward him. "Jonas, things might feel impossible right now, but you don't have to carry this burden alone." He placed a firm yet comforting hand on the man's shoulder. "There are better ways, and you can be part of them." The pilot, who had been informed of the situation, announced that the flight would make an emergency landing in Hawaii. The tension in the cabin was still palpable, but the crisis had been defused. Oliver, who had watched everything as if in a trance, felt something shift within himself. He looked at Elon with admiration, but also with a newfound understanding of what it meant to lead, not with ego, but with empathy and purpose. As the plane began its descent, Oliver knew that night had changed him forever, and that perhaps it was the beginning of something he didn't yet fully understand. The plane landed with a soft jolt on the runway of Honolulu International Airport. The cabin lights brightened, illuminating exhausted but relieved faces. The low murmur of passengers filled the space as flight attendants worked quickly to ensure everyone's safety. Jonas remained seated, his head bowed, as though the weight of his actions still pressed heavily on his shoulders. Oliver watched silently, processing everything that had happened. The man he had dismissed at the start of the flight had shown him something he never expected to witness: true leadership. Elon, now seated near Jonas, spoke calmly to him, though his words were too quiet to be overheard. Police officers waited on the tarmac, their dark uniforms a stark contrast to the subdued calm of the cabin. Two officers entered the plane, their footsteps firm but controlled as they approached Jonas. His removal was quiet and solemn. Jonas rose slowly, offering no resistance, and walked out escorted by the officers. Before leaving, he glanced back at Elon. There was no anger in his eyes, just a mix of gratitude and resignation. As Jonas disappeared through the airplane door, the cabin seemed to let out another collective sigh of relief. Elon, now alone, adjusted his jacket and returned to his seat, as if everything had returned to normal. But for Oliver, nothing felt normal. He knew that night marked a turning point. After disembarking, the first-class passengers were the first to leave, as usual. Oliver, however, hesitated, watching as Elon remained seated, calmly reviewing something on his phone. Gathering his courage, Oliver approached, his voice carrying more humility than it had in years. "Mr. Musk," he began, stammering slightly. "I just wanted to say, what you did back there, it was incredible. I don't know how you managed to stay so calm. I don't think I ever could have." Elon looked up, a small but genuine smile curving his lips. "It wasn't as hard as it looked," he said. "When you understand the reason behind someone's anger, it becomes easier to connect." Closing his phone, he gave Oliver his full attention. The real challenge is figuring out what to do about it afterward. Oliver nodded slowly, absorbing the words. He wanted to say more, to express the wave of admiration and regret he felt, but the words seemed to escape him. Sensing his hesitation, Elon took the initiative. "You mentioned wanting to make an impact earlier. If that's really what you want, Oliver, then start small, but start now. The world doesn't need more people criticizing aimlessly. It needs people willing to solve problems, no matter how small they seem." Elon's words carried a weight that struck Oliver deeply. He, who had always considered himself a visionary, now realized he had barely begun to grasp what that truly meant. Before Oliver could respond, Elon stood, casually adjusting his jacket. "Good luck, Oliver," Elon said, patting him lightly on the shoulder before walking toward the exit. Oliver remained standing, watching as Elon disappeared among the other passengers. There was something about him, a combination of humility and greatness, that made it seem like the weight of the world could be carried with inspiring ease. Back in the terminal, Oliver sat on one of the metal benches, the muffled announcements blending with the bustle of travelers. He opened his laptop, but this time it wasn't to review spreadsheets or craft a self-congratulatory social media post. Instead, he began to write, his hands moving quickly over the keyboard as ideas poured out. It wasn't about how he could promote his startup. It was about something much larger, creating a project to help underserved communities integrate into the digital world. He knew it was just the beginning, a small step, but it was a step in a direction he had never considered before. As the plane prepared to continue its journey to Tokyo, Oliver gazed at the illuminated runway outside. For the first time in years, he didn't feel defeated. He felt different. Perhaps for the first time, he was ready to listen more and speak less, just as Elon had advised. Oliver's journey wasn't about surpassing Elon Musk, but about surpassing the man he had been before that flight. And that, he realized, was a far greater challenge. Late at night, Oliver finally arrived at the hotel where he would stay until his rescheduled flight to Tokyo. He carried his laptop in one hand and a nearly empty cup of coffee in the other. His mind, however, was racing. He couldn't shake off Elon Musk's words or the haunted, desperate look in Jonas's eyes. It was as though both men, in entirely different ways, had drawn a map to the type of change Oliver needed to pursue. Inside his room, Oliver collapsed into a chair by the window, staring at the city lights outside. For the first time in years, his thoughts weren't occupied by growth metrics, investor reports, or marketing strategies. He was thinking about something larger, purpose. He opened his laptop again, revisiting the notes he had jotted down in the terminal. The ideas were still rough, but they contained the framework for something he knew had potential. Social impact platforms, he typed as a title, his fingers moving purposefully across the keyboard. His vision was to create a system that connected small-scale entrepreneurs from underserved communities with investors who wanted to fund meaningful, local projects, focusing on technology access, sustainable energy, and education. But Oliver knew that launching a project wasn't enough. He needed to better understand the people he wanted to help. He needed to be more like Elon, listening before speaking, understanding before acting. Determined, he did something he had never done before. He picked up his phone and called his assistant in Los Angeles. "I need a complete overhaul of my schedule for the next month. I want to visit social projects, public schools, and underserved communities. Find people who can teach me what they really need, he said, his voice steady. The assistant, clearly surprised, hesitated before responding. Of course, Mr. Bennett. I'll start organizing that right away. In the days that followed, Oliver immersed himself in an entirely new routine. Instead of attending meetings with executives, he visited schools in struggling neighborhoods, spoke with community leaders, and spent hours listening to stories from people like Jonas. At first, it was uncomfortable. He felt out of place, a stranger trying to connect with realities he had previously ignored. But slowly he began to understand. During one visit to a small, underfunded school on the outskirts of Los Angeles, a young teacher caught his attention. She had improvised a computer lab with donated equipment and outdated machines. Yet the children were engaged, curious, and eager to learn. Oliver was struck by her creativity and resilience. How do you keep all of this running? He asked as he observed one of her classes. The teacher smiled, exhausted but with a sparkle in her eyes. It's hard, but these kids deserve the chance to dream, to see beyond the reality they're living in. We don't need much. Just someone to believe in them. Those words stayed with Oliver. He realized that his project couldn't just be about connecting resources. It had to be about inspiring and empowering people to believe they could make a difference. Months later, Impact Connect, the platform Oliver had envisioned, was launched in a pilot phase. The concept was simple but powerful, a network where local ideas could gain visibility and support, and where investors could fund projects that mattered to their communities. In the first month, small-scale initiatives began to emerge. A solar farm in a rural area, a digital inclusion program for schools, and a water treatment project for an isolated village. The initiative quickly gained attention, not because of its grandeur, but because of the way it resonated with people. Oliver's name began circulating again in conferences and articles, but this time not as the arrogant CEO of before. He was described as someone who had grasped the true meaning of leadership. And amidst it all, Oliver didn't forget about Jonas. Through some investigation, he discovered that Jonas was receiving psychological care and legal assistance thanks to the police's intervention. Oliver made it a point to visit him at a community center where Jonas had started volunteering. When they met, Jonas seemed like a different person. There was a new calmness in him, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there on the flight. I had to see you, Oliver said, shaking Jonas's hand. You changed the way I see the world. I wanted to thank you. Jonas looked surprised, but nodded slowly. You gave me hope that day, Jonas replied. I never thought anyone would actually listen to what I had to say. The two spoke for hours, and Oliver left that meeting with even more clarity about the mission he was trying to build. Years later, sitting in the audience of a global technology conference, Oliver watched as Elon Musk walked onto the stage for his keynote speech. The crowd erupted in applause, but Oliver simply smiled, remembering the flight that had changed his life. When the speech ended, Oliver approached to greet him. Elon looked at him, clearly recognizing his face. Oliver, how are you? Elon asked with a smile. Better than ever, Oliver replied. And part of that is thanks to you. Elon tilted his head, curious, but saying nothing further. Oliver, however, knew he didn't need to explain. He had found what he had been searching for: purpose, humility, and a new way to make an impact on the world. And it all began on that flight. Late into the night, Oliver finally returned to his hotel room, but sleep evaded him. Instead, he sat by the window, laptop open, staring at the city lights below. In his mind, he replayed the events of the past few months. The flight that had changed everything, Elon Musk's calm and empathetic approach, and the stories he'd heard from people like Jonas. For years, Oliver had been focused on growth and recognition, but now his thoughts centered on something much larger: creating genuine, lasting impact. The platform he'd launched, Impact Connect, had exceeded his initial expectations. What started as an idea had grown into a network connecting people with ideas to those who could support them. It wasn't just about technology or funding. It was about trust, empowerment, and solving real problems in underserved communities. Projects began to flourish. In a rural town, a solar farm provided energy to families for the first time. A small school established a digital learning center. In a remote village, clean water became accessible thanks to a filtration project funded through the platform. Oliver saw the results of his work not just in numbers or reports, but in the faces of those who benefited from it. Still, he couldn't forget Jonas. It wasn't just the man's desperation on the plane that haunted him. It was the reality that there were countless others like him, people whose voices needed to be heard. Oliver had visited Jonas several times since their first meeting at the community center. Each time, he learned something new about resilience, about hope, and about the importance of listening. A year later, Oliver was invited to speak at a global technology summit in San Francisco. It was a surreal moment, standing on a stage that years ago he might have used to boast about his startup's valuation or newest product. But this time, his speech was different. He spoke about the flight that had changed his life. He recounted the interaction with Elon Musk, the encounter with Jonas, and how those moments had forced him to confront his own arrogance and ignorance. "I realized that I wasn't listening," Oliver said to the audience. "I wasn't paying attention to the people I claimed I wanted to help. And the truth is, real impact starts with humility. It starts with asking, what can I do to truly understand and empower others?" The room was silent, the kind of silence that comes when every person in the audience is fully present. Oliver's words resonated because they came from a place of genuine transformation. For the first time in his career, he wasn't just talking about change, he was embodying it. After the conference, Oliver stayed behind to greet attendees. Among the faces in the crowd, he spotted someone familiar. Elon Musk stood off to the side, watching him with a faint smile. Oliver approached, his heart beating faster than it had during his speech. "Elon," Oliver said, extending his hand. Elon shook it warmly. "You've come a long way, Oliver." "Thanks to you," Oliver admitted. "I don't think I'd be where I am today if it weren't for that flight." Elon tilted his head slightly, his expression curious. "I didn't do much. You're the one who chose to act." Oliver smiled, knowing Elon was right. The flight had been a catalyst, but the change had come from within. As they parted ways, Oliver couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come, not just as a professional, but as a person. The flight had taught him more than leadership. It had taught him to listen, to empathize, and to understand the power of humility. And as he walked away, he realized that his journey wasn't just about making an impact on the world. It was also about becoming the best version of himself. It all began on Flight 317 to Tokyo.